Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. The Spark Knight Klee is returning for another awesomely fun summer adventure in the Archipelago Islands in patch 2.8. In this video, we'll be going over 50 things to consider for debatably the strongest fighter in Mondstadt's super cute Rerun. Before we kick things off with today's The Brutal Truth About Insert Character Here video, we need to pause to appreciate just how dastardly adorable Klee is. And also, let's take a second to appreciate that this entire game is actually completely enjoyable as a free-to-play player. That's right, it's today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Did you know there's over 600 champions to collect? Seriously, that's over 10 times the number of champions in Genshin Impact. Just scan the QR code or smash the link down below to get started on both mobile and PC. This month, it's all about High Elves. Elves in Raid have survived for thousands of years through orc invasions in the Lizardmen Empire. Siroth, who's the big bad of Raid, corrupted some of the happy High Elves into emo Dark Elves. However, emos were cool like 20 years ago, so naturally the High Elves expelled them and secured Arabia as the ultimate mainstream country of Talaria. And this month there are 5 entire new champions coming out. There's also a ton of quality of life, including updating the Champion Vault and the Summer Splash event where you can get a new skin for Trunda the Dwarf. My favorite High Elf is the Arbiter because she is basically the waifu of Raid Shadow Legends. And my second favorite is the Royal Guard. It's nice to collect some rare champions that don't always look like an MC. And there's a Deliana Chase event where all you have to do is log in for 7 days between now and July 28th to get the legendary High Elf Deliana. Completely free. Deliana is one of the best supports in the game. And once you're in game before July 20th, just enter the promo code MyDeliana to get 50 XP brews and ton of silver to max your legendary hero Deliana to level 50. There's never been a better time to get started. New players, use my link or scan the QR code right here and get a free starter pack worth almost $30, a free champion, Aina, and this cool in-game loot. You'll find your rewards here in your inbox for the next 30 days only. Huge thanks to Raid for sponsoring today's video. I'm sure most of you know that Klee holds a special place in my heart. My channel banner has her in it, my intro has her in it, my first kind of DPS-ish showdown comparison video was between her and Diluc, and frankly, I played through most of the story with Klee. She is just so ready for an adventure, with her adventuring backpack and reciting her adventuring rules. miHoYo really knocked it out of the park with her adorable, endearing design and with imbuing us Klee-havers with that awesome desire to explore the wonderful world of Teyvat. Those early Teyvat adventuring days will forever be a fond memory for me and many other Klee-havers. And all that really began my crazy YouTube journey as well. Anyway, enough reminiscing, let's get back to some brief history. Klee's second rerun is happening over an entire year from her previous rerun, which was on June 9th, 2021. She's finally coming back for another summer adventure on July 13th, 2022. Perhaps at this rate, we're going to be seeing her every summer. This is actually one of the longest time frames for a character's rerun, if not the actual longest. Let me know in the comments below if this is actually the longest rerun, since I didn't actually compare it with every single other character and their reruns. Really lengthy intro aside, let's get into the nitty-gritty by talking about Klee's basic attacks. Klee's basic attacks actually have reasonable damage output, and her charge attacks output a very solid 283.25 damage multiplier at talent level 10 and in a rather short amount of time. These damage numbers make her fairly viable as a main DPS. Her basic attacks also have a lot of skill expression by mastering the timings for what is colloquially called the machine gun walk, and for what is lacking a colloquial name, the normal attack jump cancel. Both of these methods make Klee a bundle of joy to use while significantly improving her combat efficiency and mobility, and thus makes her very satisfying and rewarding to use once you've mastered these techniques. Despite that though, when you have stamina available or if you just want some Unga Boonga playstyle, N1CA is generally considered her optimal way to output DPS. And given the modern playstyles of Genshin Impact, it's rare to find yourself spamming the above text, so for those that aren't as sweaty of gamers, N1C spam is reliable and rewarding as well. Klee's normal attacks have standard ICD and her charge attacks have no ICD. This means that Klee actually applies a lot of pyro. And her charge attacks do a ton of poise damage, which for those unfamiliar basically means it does a ton of knockback. Seriously, who else can knock down and stun lock both medium-sized Vishaps and the large doggos? I can't think of anyone else that comes close to Klee's charge attacks stun locking capabilities on specific enemies. And Klee's charge attacks, while looking to have a small vertical hitbox, actually are fairly reliable at hitting things in Venti's black hole. This makes her quite compatible with one of the best supports in the entire game, and her charge attacks provide 2 energy when they crit. This makes it a good battery for the entire team, and in a typical team rotation, Klee can generally perform around 4 to 5 charge attacks, thus generating up to 8 to 10 energy, assuming you crit on something for each of them, for free for the entire team. Thanks to Klee's first passive, Klee also has a chance to gain an explosive spark from her normal attacks and elemental skill, which provide her with an explosive spark that makes the next elemental skill cost 0 stamina and provides an impressive 50% bonus damage to that charge attack. And since they're considered heavy attacks, her basic attacks, both the normal attacks and the charge attacks, are good for breaking ores and shields as well. Although not as much of a problem nowadays, all types of Hilichurl shields are destroyed by Klee's basic attacks, and she also does good damage against geo constructs, as well as various elemental shields. However, not everything is perfectly adorable about Klee's normal attacks. Her normal attacks are, in my opinion, the single clunkiest thing in the entire game. If you ever use her 3-hit normal attack string without animation canceling, it feels ridiculously sluggish, clunky, and just bad to use. You really need to use walk cancels, jump cancels, and dash cancels if you hope to effectively utilize her normal attacks. Throw in the fact that her charge attacks cost 50 stamina when you have no explosive spark, and now you end up not having any stamina to dash, further increasing her clunkiness. On top of all this, if you have cryo on Klee, all your animation timings are slower and it's really easy to then mess them up. And the damage of her basic attacks is exceptionally average based on today's standards. We have had many monstrous DPS characters since Klee like Hu Tao, Ganyu, Itto, Raiden, etc., who all have very powerful basic attacks. So while a perfectly viable option as a main DPS, there are other characters that just do more damage and are frankly much easier to use. Klee's optimal damage output, her charge attacks are unfortunately RNG based. Assuming you're spamming the N1C combo, not only do you have the standard RNG to crit like almost every other character has to deal with, but you also have her passive explosive sparks to account for. This can make the number of explosive sparks and thus charge attacks in the rotation extremely inconsistent. Then if you have her Constellation 1 or Jumpty Dumpty Mines out, or her Elemental Burst active, all these things can mess with her damage output and thus her pyro application, which is the perfect segue to talk about, while her charge attacks are vapeable and have no ICD, Klee is either unreliable to reliably vape or suffers from some serious opportunity cost by foregoing the damage from her elemental burst and or her elemental skill in order to apply enough hydro with a character like Xingqiu to vape her charge attacks. And if you also have Constellation 1, that further messes it up. Her basic attacks do have some range, but her charge attacks are basically melee attacks. This makes her effectively a melee ranged character since you really want to hit things with her charge attacks. Combined with her charge attacks costing 50 stamina and knocking enemies back and instinctively dashing to chase them down, you'll run out of stamina in no time at all. Her being melee is also a problem given that she has Catalyst Poise, which means that she is super easily interrupted when she's hit. A ton of modern characters have a ton of super armor like Raiden, Itto, etc., so this is really felt if you compare them to Klee. This problem is compounded by the fact that she is also stationary while performing all her attacks, and she's often starved of stamina due to charge attack spam, thus she's not able to dash and reposition and dodge as much as she'd like. Well, let's move on to another egregiously cute portion of her kit, her elemental skill, the Jumpy Dumpty. For the longest time I called it Jumpty Dumpty before realizing that the Jumpy had no T in it, and I still often accidentally call it Jumpty Dumpty. Anyway, let me know if you also did that. From a combat perspective though, Klee's Jumpy Dumpties are very interesting. Klee's Jumpy Dumpties output a lot of pyro damage, 3 main hits on the Jumpy and 8 mines after that. At level 10, if everything hits, that's 986.4% pyro damage in a single E cast. Considering you can do this twice, theoretically that's up to 1972.8% damage in just 2 presses of her E. Being more realistic however, not all the mines are going to hit, and assuming let's say 3 mines hit, that's still 691.2% for a single E. The point still stands that Klee's 2 Jumpy Dumpties provide a lot of front-loaded pyro damage. On top of that, each Jumpy generates 4 particles each. While not good in terms of particles per second, this does allow Klee to front-load 8 pyro particles, making her team's first rotation not only do a lot of damage, but also tend to solve a lot of energy issues if you have multiple pyro characters on her team. You can even pre-lay her mines for some interesting shenanigans, as of course they apply pyro when an enemy hits them. There are some fun and unique domain speedruns or boss nuke showcases that utilize this unique attribute. And like her charge attacks, Klee's Jumpy Dumpties have a deceptively large vertical hitbox and will generally hit things in Venti's black hole. As for some of its shortcomings, well, its biggest one is by far its 20-second cooldown for each Jumpy Dumpty. This is one of the longest cooldowns on an elemental skill, and since you can toss 2 of these, this ends up being a total of 40 seconds of cooldown for 2 Jumpy Dumpties. You will often not have both Jumpy Dumpties available for repeated domain runs or for Abyss retries. Another problem with her elemental skill is that you cannot have 2 sets of mines on the field. Tossing a second Jumpy Dumpty leads to the first set of Jumpy Dumpty mines prematurely exploding. An annoyance I also have with it is that if the mines spawn on a stationary enemy, like for example a knockdown Regisvine, the mines don't actually explode even if they overlap with the Regisvine. So because of this design flaw, sometimes the second Jumpy Dumpty mines prematurely exploding the first set of mines is actually a good thing, and the damage it outputs can be quite unreliable since it travels forward by quite a lot. Enemies moving around can easily cause 1 or more of the bounces to whiff. On top of that, you of course have the mines to account for, which spread out a ton and are even more unreliable to connect with the enemy. Next, let's talk about her adorably named Elemental Burst, Sparks and Splash. Besides having one of the best animations in the game as she converts one of her countless explodey friends into Sparks and Splash, her burst also provides decent passive damage while it's active and while Klee is on the field. It shoots between 3 to 5 sparks per wave, which ends up being 3.8 sparks on average, and has 6 total waves. At talent level 10, this is an average of 1749.9% damage multiplier. Quite impressive in terms of a DPS to how long the burst took ratio. Now, a much more niche but interesting pro for it is that it has very low poise damage or knockback. This allows it to sometimes apply pyro on an enemy even after Mona's elemental burst hits them, and then Klee can pop Mona's burst with something else in her kit, leading to some niche but interesting Mona nukes. And unsurprisingly, due to its homing nature, it has great synergy with Venti's black hole, or even for hitting hard to hit flying enemies in general. It surprisingly does have a bit of AoE as well, thus synergizing with Venti's black hole even more. Klee's elemental burst also snapshots. However, Klee's elemental burst, while looking fantastic, does have a long 1.666666667 second animation. It also only has around a 66.666666667% uptime with its 10-second duration and 15-second cooldown. And most importantly and unfortunately, it gets cancelled once Klee swaps off the field. This is sadly the biggest drawback in my opinion, as you need to stay on the field for the entire 10 seconds to get the maximum benefit from her elemental burst. And last but not least, the full potential of her elemental burst is locked behind her Constellation 4, which provides a significant 555% nuke when she swaps off while her elemental burst is active. The next question that I always answer in one of these "The Brutal Truth About Insert Character Here" videos is Insert Character Here free-to-play friendly? And the answer to that in Klee's case is so-so. Constellation Zero Klee, while being strong enough to clear all the content in the game, is unfortunately lacking in comparison to top-tier characters like Ayaka, Ganyu, Raiden, Hu Tao, and others. Her main role of an on-field main DPS, while she does well at it, she is quite average by today's standard. Catalysts are also extremely volatile, with the best free-to-play accessible, yet still gacha-dependent, Widsith being her best option. And we all know the problem with the Widsith having a somewhat clunky buff that restricts rotations, as well as 20 seconds or 666.666666667% downtime, as well as an RNG based buff. All of these things make the Widsith a great 4-star weapon with a lot of problems. As far as other free-to-play accessible weapons, there are 2 decent event weapons in the Dodoko Tails and the Elfsworn Eye. Of course, if you aren't super unlucky with the gacha system, it's likely that you also have the Widsith by now. As for the 5-star weapons, well, we all know the Catalysts have a bunch of really mediocre 5-star weapon options. All of them have different and significant issues. Klee can be a low investment support character as well. Being Pyro, she's able to provide Pyro resonance in conjunction with Bennett. Her mines also allow for her to be marginally feasible as a Tenacity user, and of course being a Catalyst user, she can equip the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. Fortunately, this setup requires little to no investment. However, the problem with this is that she's taking up an entire team slot, and there's almost always a better support option than Klee in this specific slot. There's also Yanfei, who provides her own set of benefits as a TDO DS support, like her Constellation 4, which provides a shield when she uses her burst. However, when Klee is at Constellation 2, she is still occasionally used for some nuke showcases thanks to the defense shred that her mines provide, but even then it's just for nuke showcases. So as a TDO DS Tenacity support, Klee unfortunately is almost never the best general usage pyro support character, mostly because Bennett exists. Her Constellations 2 and 4, while good, aren't really worth it by today's constellation to cost ratio. Kazuha's Constellation 2, Raiden's Constellation 2 and 3, Ayaka's Constellations 2, 3, and 4, etc. are just a few examples of much higher valued constellations, and farming the Crimson Wish domain is resin inefficient due to the Lava Walkers also being there. Her resin efficiency is further hurt by needing to level all 3 of her abilities for the best performance, and she really appreciates having a really well invested sub DPS character like Xiangling for her mono pyro team. Klee's Ascension stat is also not either crit rate or crit damage. Almost all the modern top tier DPS characters nowadays have one of the crits as an Ascension stat due to it being the hardest to optimally acquire and due to it helping a ton with artifact farming and building. Now despite all that, Klee is still able to handle pretty much all the hardest content in the game with some of her better team comps like her mono pyro team. So for those of you that like Klee a lot, you can rest assured knowing that, while not a top tier DPS behemoth like Ayaka or Ganyu, Klee can easily hold her own if you're willing to invest the proper time in mastering her animation cancels and if you're willing to invest into her supports as well. We've got a few more important things to consider that don't really fall into any of the aforementioned categories. Klee has a great exploration passive for those that still need some Mondstadt signature items. Now, I personally haven't needed any of Mondstadt's signature items for a very long time, but whenever I do need them, Klee is hopping into my party immediately. Klee applies a ton of pyro. This can surprisingly be both a good and a bad thing. It's good in the sense that she breaks a lot of elemental shields very quickly. However, it makes vaping her attacks very difficult, if not pretty much impractical. I personally haven't done much testing with Yelan and Xingqiu with Klee since my Yelan and Xingqiu are both at Constellation 6 now, and thus won't accurately reflect most people's experience with them and Klee. But there are some other obvious problems with that combination, like the 4-character team slot syndrome, as you need to forego 2 out of Klee's 3 best support characters, Bennett, Kazuha, and Zhongli. And depending on the combination you choose, you will often be left with no healer. Despite that, let me know down below what you think about the Xingqiu, Yelan, Klee combo, and if Klee can vape most of her stuff in this situation. Now, one of her best teams, which is her mono pyro team, ends up hogging Bennett and Kazuha and also Xiangling as well. You can replace Xiangling with someone else like Zhongli if a shield is needed, but generally speaking, Klee is best with a pyro damage focused team as of today. This hogs 3 of the best supports or sub DPSs in the game and can make team building for the other half pretty difficult. And frankly, most attack scaling characters will have success with some combination of these support characters. And sadly, Klee has kind of been at least side-gradedly power crept by Hu Tao and Yoimiya. Hu Tao in particular is problematic for Klee's position in the meta since Hu Tao only needs either Xingqiu or Yelan to be exceptional, whereas Klee is fighting for the top supports in the game. Yoimiya is more clearly of a side grade from Klee since she often relies on the same supports that Klee does and will thus, end up taking Klee's spot in the team. Despite all that, perhaps the single most important thing about Klee is that she can do a barrel roll. This just further adds to her adorableness. Sadly though, from a gameplay perspective, Klee being a child female character model comes with the worst dash in the game. It provides poor mobility and jumping from it feels incredibly clunky and slow. Klee is also rarely used nowadays. Klee has often been the lowest used feature 5-star character. Again, this doesn't mean that she's not good or incapable of handling the Abyss cycles, but this does demonstrate why Klee is not a heavily recommended character to pull for, unlike Kazuha for example, who is always extremely highly used. And lastly, Klee's speedrunning glory days have long since passed her, as the playing field has gotten much more power crept and much more crowded. Although admittingly her times are almost never the slowest in comparison to other 5-star characters, she has also not been the fastest in a very long time. Now I'll provide a quick summary of our favorite pyromaniac, Klee, starting with her pros. Klee is, in my opinion, one of the cutest characters in all of fiction. She is reasonable as a main DPS character, and she has high skill expression with the N1 walk cancel and N2 jump cancel. She still has N1 charge attack for Unga Boonga players and is actually optimal in many scenarios. And she has no ICD on her charge attacks, and she has standard ICD on her normal attacks. She has huge stagger and knockback on her charge attacks, and her charge attacks even hit things in Venti's black hole. Her charge attacks generate 2 energy for everyone in the party on crit, and her explosive spark enhances her charge attacks. Her basic attacks are also considered heavy attacks and break shields, geo, and ores. Her jumpy dumpties have great multipliers and also have 2 charges, and each of them generate a whopping 4 pyroparticles each. She can prelay mines for some shenanigans, and her E has a deceptively large vertical hitbox and can hit things in Venti's black hole. Her elemental burst does a lot of damage over 10 seconds, and the sparks have some small AoE, making it even better with Venti's black hole. Her burst's low poise damage provides niche Mona nuke combos, and her free-to-play weapons are solid with the Widsith, Dodoko Tails, and Oathsworn Eye. And she can be used as a low investment tenacity TDODS support character. She is compatible with pretty much all the best supports in the game: Bennett, Kazuha, Venti, and Zhongli. Her passive helps find Mondstadt items, and her whole kit applies a ton of pyro. She is useful for some whales, for some nuke showcases at Constellation 2, and a mono pyro Klee team is still surprisingly solid. And most importantly, she can do a barrel roll. And now for her cons. Klee is clunky as she is cute, and she has relatively average damage output. She has quite a bit of RNG in her kit with her passive, Constellation 1, Q spark count, and E mines. Her charge attacks burn through tons of stamina, 50 stamina each, and her normal attacks and charge attacks have different range, which basically makes her a melee character due to her charge attack range. She's easily interruptible, being a stationary catalyst user with no stamina because she burns all of her stamina on her charge attacks, and it is difficult or costly to reliably vapor damage. Her jumpy dumpties have a massive 20-second cooldown each, which ends up being a whopping 40 seconds for both charges. She can't have 2 sets of mines out on the field, and various parts of her jumpy dumpties can whiff. She has a long Q animation of around 1.6667 seconds, and worst of all, swapping cancels her Q's sparks. Her Q uptime is only around 66.667%, and her best 4-star weapon, the Widsith, has a lot of problems including uptime and RNG, as well as it being in the gacha. All the 5-star catalysts kind of suck or have some serious issues, and her TDO/DS/tenacity support build is met in comparison to Bennett. Her constellations provide low value in comparison to other characters, and it's resin inefficient to farm the Crimson Wish domain for Klee. Her Ascension stat is not crit, which helps a ton with building characters, and sadly she has very low usage rates in Abyss 12. She relies heavily on the best supports in the game, Bennett, Kazuha, Venti, and Zhongli, and she is somewhat power crept or at least side graded by Hu Tao and Yoimiya. She has the female child model, which has the worst dash in the game, and finally she is a bit mediocre at speed running. So there you go, another overly detailed The Brutal Truth About Insert Character Here video, and this time for pretty much the cutest character in all of fiction. Now I will provide a little bit of bonus advice and my overall recommendations for Klee. In terms of her in the meta, unless Dendro heavily rewards tons of pyro application, Klee is unfortunately not a character I highly recommend pulling for. However, the single most important thing about Genshin Impact is to have fun, and Klee is an absolute delight to use, especially if you're into some skill expression with her animation cancels. And you can rest assured knowing that Klee is also perfectly capable of handling the hardest content in the game with the proper support. Also, I regularly make Genshin Impact videos ranging from Caesar showcases, DPS showdowns, guide videos, and more. So be sure to smash the subscribe button, as it's the best and easiest way for you to support my work. Also, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment for the YouTube algorithm. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Want to Lose, signing out.